Just as by way of introduction, this is pretty different than most things that I do here, and I'm actually going to disappoint some of you by not showing very much data. So I'll show you some in back afterwards if you need to get your fix. We're going to show you data, but not data we generated. And this is kind of grew out of some presentations I've made internationally. So I've spent some of my life in other parts of the world and mostly working on soybeans. Back in the day before, after I graduated from Ohio State, then went to Purdue, my wife and I spent 4 years in Bangladesh, and our job was to try to introduce soybeans as a crop. I won't tell you how successful we were, but when we left, there were not very many more than when we came. But it was an interesting, I've been fascinated ever since by why soybeans grow where they grow, what's happened over the time since then, and I'll show you some numbers on that. The world has really changed. The world of soybeans has really changed, and soybeans has really become a world crop, almost in our lifetime. So we'll talk about that a little bit and then bring it home a little bit more and talk about why it works here well as a crop, and maybe a little bit about the future. So it's kind of a fun thing, a little bit lighter than we normally do. But I've had here, why the question? Many of the best crop producing regions in the world concentrate on high yielding grain crops, not legumes. So if you go to India or China, much of their best land is reserved for rice and wheat. In the Corn Belt, and I took the Corn Belt name off, by the way, Harold, because soybeans objected. So I said, well, we'll call it the Midwestern U.S., but it's the Corn Belt. And they don't grow legumes. Legumes have always been considered sort of an auxiliary crop. Even in China, East Asia, where they grew historically, soybeans were kind of more of a garden crop, subsistence crop, than they were a main crop, because people had to produce calories first, and the grain crops worked better for that generally. The prominence of the U.S. and China in growing soybeans has been challenged, of course, by South America and some other regions. We'll look at that. Some have wondered if soybean production in the U.S. might fade. I remember talk of this probably 10 years ago, and they said, well, we're going to bring in, bioenergy crops, and we're going to bring in crops, and soybeans probably won't have much of a place in our cropping systems. That certainly hasn't been the case so far, and we're at historically high acreage in the U.S. right now. But generally, that we find something better, then soybeans can go. And we'll just buy our soybeans from South America. So that's one of the things, that's some of the reasons why I suggested this as a topic, because, and I'm not here to raise a bunch of threats, nobody's going to come and take your soybeans away, but it's an interesting prospect that in some countries soybean acreage is really stagnated and is actually headed down, and China is one of those. So let me just show you a few of these, and you don't have to take too many notes. It will be on the test, but just in general terms. So you can go in and find that the USDA WASDE is the world supply projection, and this is the 2017 production basically. And so here's the millions of bushels that are being produced today. And I didn't put the world up here, but it's somewhere in the 13 billion bushels range. The United States produces 34%, Brazil 32%, and Argentina 16%. So Brazil and Argentina, if you want to consider them together, are a bigger dog than the U.S. right now in soybean production. And this is a really high year for production in the U.S. So, that's the rest of the world. So you see the other countries here, and countries that we often, connect to. The one that we connect to soybeans more than any other is China, because that's where the crop came from originally, eastern China and Korea. So they're down at 4% of the world's production today. And then on down the line, India is 5th ranked today, and that's been a huge change in the last 50 years. And then some other countries produce some. South American countries, Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, and we see these others. But they're all down in that 1% range, and the rest of the world, and there's lots of countries that produce some soybeans in the world, but total 2% of the production. Here's what the exports were, and the United States and Brazil and Argentina, Brazil and the United States are really the big exporters. Argentina exports protein and oil, and so it doesn't get counted quite the same more than others. But you can see here in terms of percentage, Brazil and the U.S. export over 80% of the soybeans that are exported in the world. And then other producing countries, India, they use much of it for protein and oil. Oil is their big need in India, so the protein, they export some of that to Europe as non-GMO. And obviously, the big importing countries don't export very much. So many of the countries are exporting a lot of what they produce because they don't have a lot of domestic use. For the U.S., it's about half. If you remember, I said the U.S. produced about 4.4 billion bushels, and they exported 2.1. Here are the imports then. And so this is the upside down of that previous one. And China, just look at that. 65% of the imported soybeans in the world go to one country. So is it important that China, not retaliate to steal tariffs? Absolutely. Because that would be just a disaster for us and drive down the world price. And then it drops off, and other countries are importing quite a bit for their own consumption and use. We always think of Japan as a big importer. They import everything they use. They produce almost none. But quantity-wise, it's just dwarfed by China. The European Union imports quite a bit as well. And to continue the theme then, this is the use within countries. So China, even though it's not high on the production list in terms of quantity, is by far the biggest user, using about twice as many soybean tons as the United States on an annual basis. Argentina, Brazil, European Union, most of this is where livestock is being fed, and that's where most of it is going. India uses theirs for oil production, feeds some, but livestock industry is not huge there, and they export some of the protein meal. But basically, these are ones, and some of these countries like Japan, Indonesia, Thailand are using soybeans for direct consumption by humans, as well as animal feed. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a historical thing here, and I'm not going to dwell on it too long, but this was the production by country in 1970. I just chose 70 kind of as a point in time. It's within the lifetime of many of you here in the room. I turned 20 in the 1970 and was headed to Ohio State a little bit later. But here's the millions of acres produced, 73 in 1970. The U.S. produces more acres than that today, each year. The average yield was 22 bushels per acre, and we produced 1.6 billion bushels. And the United States produced 70% of it, and China about 20%. Now, over 90% of the soybeans in 1970 were produced in those two countries, the U.S. and China. And the other ones just kind of, Brazil was starting to emerge then as a producer, but really hadn't done much yet. Look at the average yields in different places. In the U.S., it was only 27 that year. And if you look at these yields, here's Canada. It's had a good yield, but doesn't do very much production. And, some of these rounded off to less than 1. So I did these by production, in order of production, not of yield, of acres. And so high yielding ones had fewer acres. And you can see here other countries had some, but very small amounts. And then this is the production in 2016. If you go to the FAO website, you can find these statistics. They've made it really handy to pick them up now, and I converted them from metrics. So from 1970 to 2016, we went up in acreage from 73 million to 300 million, more than 4 times. Our average yield last year in 2016 was 41, and 2016 is the latest data that FAO gives, and we produced 12.3 billion bushels. The U.S. was still the largest producer in terms of quantity. It was a very good yielding year in the U.S., 52 bushels per acre. We had 83 million acres. Brazil was very close behind with 82 million. Their yields were lower, but you can see now how, the only ones in double digits are United States, Brazil, and Argentina as producers in 2016, or today. And so among those, you can see there's about 80% of the soybeans were produced by those 3 countries. Remember, in 1970, 90% was produced by U.S. and China. In today, over 80% is produced by the United States, Brazil, and Argentina. And others are there, producing. China has fallen down in rank. India has overtaken it. The Indian yields aren't very high. In fact, 18 bushels is a pretty good yield under their conditions. And you can see what yields in other countries. Some high-yielding countries still produce quite a bit, and still are on this list anyway, and it's the top dozen or so in the world. And after this list, and the rest of the world had 13 million acres, yielded 25 bushels per acre, and produced less than 3% of the crop in the world. So these are the big changes. World area increased in our lifetime of most of us by 312% from 73 to 300 million acres. World yield increased by 86% from 22 to 41 bushels per acre. And world production increased by over 7-fold, almost 8-fold, from 1.6 to 12.3 billion bushels. And over the same period, just for contrast, the world corn area yield and production increased by only 66%. Yields went up more on a relative basis than soybean by 140%, and production went up a little more than 3-fold, or 229%. So let's look at what's happened on this, and I'm getting to the Midwest, but we're taking the roundabout way, because what's happened on the world stage happens within a country, across states, and so on as well. So this is the acreage as it changed from 1961. That's the first year that we get statistics from FAO to 2016. And you can see what the world increase has done, and you can see where most of it came from. Early on during that period, the first 20 years, it was in U.S., was the largest, fastest rising. And then during that time, South America started, and now South America as a total is producing, we're at about 90 million in North America acres, and South America is about close to 150 million. So as a continent, South America is the winner today. And you can see that the percentage of acres that these 2 continents, the Western Hemisphere, has is really pretty high. In other parts of the world, some of these have stagnated. We've got East Asia here, which is basically China. You can see that acreage in China really has not increased, and in recent years it's come down. So that's a big issue with it. And you might say, well, China's a big user. Why don't they produce more? I was in China a year and a half ago, and they said, I wish we'd produce more. The problem is that they have high demands for corn, for wheat, for rice, and anything they cut in acreage of those has to go to soybeans. And soybeans, you know, they're not being encouraged really that much. I mean, the government says that they'd like more soybeans produced, but you can tell that their production is sort of a drop in the bucket compared to their use. They have to buy almost all their soybeans in from other countries. And other ones, South Asia, the colors don't show up here very well. It's increased in acreage. And some of the others, I put Australia and New Zealand on there, but I don't think I'll make too much of a point. It's down here pretty close to the zero line, and it hasn't risen. Their yields are pretty good, but it's a country that just never found a reason to grow a lot of soybeans. And if you can grow something more profitable, it's the old idea of comparative advantage, as most of you know. That's what you do instead. So I apologize for the looks of these, but these are what soybean yields have done over the period. Here's the world yield here, this blue line, and the South America, North America are the lines above it. So basically, how South America, North America go, you know, that's sort of how the world goes, because we have so much of the crop between us. And in other countries, as I'm showing you here, we'll make a little bit of look. Australia, New Zealand has had good yields, as I said to you. They just don't have acres. And other countries, you've seen what the yields have done. Pretty stagnant in a lot of places. And there's a reason for that. They're growing it in areas that, to put it simply, don't have very good opportunity costs. In other words, in central India, which has gone from no soybeans to now being the 5th leading producer in the world, after the Western Hemisphere, it's the largest producing country, and their yields aren't very high. Well, they can produce them there because it really replaced sort of fallow ground. The summertime there is when they accumulate water to grow the wheat crop in the winter. And so they can get soybeans in without a lot of opportunity costs, and that's what they've learned to do. So the world price is high. They like that. They export some of their meal, and farmers, you know, have been made prosperous in a relative sense by introducing soybeans into that system. They have more processing capacity than they have crop, which is kind of interesting. Quite a bit more, in fact, but that's just the way it goes. So we'll come back to that just a little bit. But this is production, and no surprises there. We've already seen how that went, with South America becoming predominant. North America is still high, mostly the U.S., and other countries just kind of in there, but not real major. So it's a new world crop, as I say here, like no other. Over the last 60 years, production has grown nearly eightfold to become the leading crop protein source on the planet. 335 million metric tons, that's 12.3 billion bushels. At 37% protein, provides 46.5 grams of high-quality protein per person per day for the 7.3 billion people on the planet. That's equivalent to about 60% of the worldwide consumption of 77 grams of protein per day, per person. Now, that's not all going to people, obviously. Most of it's going to livestock. If push came to shove, however, that's a big inflator in there that, you know, if people are going to starve, but you can't feed unless you stop feeding it to animals, we assume in a lot of places the animals will starve and the people will eat. But it certainly is there, and I've calculated in rough terms, you know, the state of Illinois could produce all the protein, oil, and fat that the U.S. consumes if everybody just ate corn and soybean. And that's not going to happen very soon. 30% of the daily fat consumption. Much of this fat consumption, much of the oil extracted from soybeans is used for human consumption. And it provides about 30%. Humans eat daily fat consumption in the world is about 79 grams, I believe. And so soybeans produces about 30% of that. It's not the best oil seed, pure oil seed in the world in terms of yield. That would be oil palm. But the protein and oil combination make it a crop that's just unprecedented. You know, we have legumes that have a lot of protein, not much oil. We have oil seeds with a lot of oil, but not much protein. Only soybean has the balance that it has. All of this is from a humble legume of East Asian origin that was more or less a subsistence crop 100 years ago in most parts of the world. So in North America, this is what we see, and I'll show you a few of these just to try to make this connection between is it yields that are driving production or not. And this is the yield curve here, and this is the area in millions of acres. And so you can see here we're approaching 90. This is from 2017, the highest one. So you can see what our yields were. This might be from 2016. But in any case, you can see our yields have been, some people think it's actually curving upwards, the U.S. yield. I guess I don't know if I have an opinion on that yet. That's driven by the last couple of years. But you can see that our area has also gone up to the highest now it's ever been. So we can, think about, and I'll talk about where the land came from for this. That's an important aspect as well. I mentioned to you earlier that Canada is lumped with the U.S. and North America, of course. But in Canada, I talked to someone recently from Manitoba, and they said something like a fourth of their canola acres have been replaced by soybean. They're becoming, and I don't think it's just climate change. Some people might say it is, but they're becoming a producer. The producer in Canada typically has been Eastern Canada, so Ontario, which is a lot like Michigan and Ohio in terms of production capability. So they have good yields there, and that's where a lot of this is coming from. And they grow some out to Quebec and so on too. But you can see here that their yields have pretty much kept pace with the yields in the U.S., but their area has recently come up, but it's just a fraction of what it is in the U.S. This is East Asia, China, and I mentioned to you their acres has actually gone down. Yields are pretty stagnant, and acreage has actually fallen. And it's completely due to the fact that they have other crops that they prefer to grow and not import to feed that many 1.4 billion people. South America, we've talked enough about that one, went from no acreage basically back in 1960 to the acreage that you see today. They're over 140 million acres. And the yields have been just a steady upward progression. They're still at a lower level than they are here in the U.S. And, nobody knows if these are going to continue to rise at that level for the next 30 years. My guess, and I'll return to this, in South America, they're growing mostly in the subtropical area, Brazil, and insect pressures are building steadily over time there. I suppose the other way to say it is the honeymoon may be coming to an end a little bit. And with their climate, they're going to battle some serious insects. John, you might tell us about that. South Asia or India has been a real success story in the world. Their yields are low and kind of bouncy, as you can see here. But with them, if you're making 8 or 9 bushels per acre, you're making money. A lot of it's produced by hand, harvested by hand. Low cost, labor costs for weeding is one of their big issues. They use some herbicides. And I saw good soybean fields there, but a good soybean field there is going to yield 30 bushels. And typically, they look like they're about this tall. They plant them late. They plant them at the end of June, early July, when the monsoon starts, and they're harvesting them in September. So it's not out there very long. Europe has good yields, yields that are about as high as the world average yields. They really haven't been increasing very much. Their acreage only recently has started to come up some. And I didn't take the time to look where in Europe it grows. But as soybean world turns, worldwide production shows no sign of slowing, with roughly 3/4 of the increase coming from more area and 1/4 from higher yields. These changes are inconsistent, though. And I just detailed for you some of these changes. We have areas with a large increase in yield with stable yields or increase in area. South America is a large increase in area with increasing yield. North America, our yields, our areas increasing only modestly as yields increase. And Europe, some recent increases in area but with stable yields. And East Asia is showing a decline in area with stable yields. So these are, the pictures changing over time. Who knows what's going to happen into the future? But I don't see things, suddenly countries stopping or starting with big acreage. It doesn't really happen that way. Changes are mostly in response to changes in comparative advantage compared to other crops. So let's go to the U.S. then and take a look at this. I went back to 1924. You can actually go back earlier than that with NASS numbers and look these up. But I went back to a time when soybeans were being introduced in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but yields were fairly low, around 20 bushel. I have some reports from back in the day. My predecessors at the University of Illinois used to go out and they had a lot of strip planting and stuff. And some of the yields were not bad, 25, 30 bushel in some cases. And these were mostly plant introductions, but hadn't had much breeding done on them at all, if any. And so you can see then, since that time, what our yields have done here. Sorry, the yields are coming across. That doesn't look right to me. I'm sorry, I started wrong. This is corn. Thanks for pointing that out. I would have got there eventually because none of the soybean one doesn't look like this. But notice in corn, we had over 80 million acres of corn back in the 20s. The highest recorded numbers we have are actually in the 1930s, the early 30s, when your grandfathers may have been farming. And then came the Depression, and then came, World War II, and our acres went down for different reasons, and then they came back up a little bit. But acreage really in corn hasn't moved very much, as yields have really gone up. Sorry, this is soybeans, so get back on track. Back in the 20s, they were actually about 10 bushels per acre. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That may have been important, lower corn yields compared to soybean yields than we have today. And you can see that our acreage basically went from nothing, 1924, up to what it is today. Higher than the corn acreage, certainly higher than corn for grain, and I think higher than total corn this last year, and probably in 2018, if things hold. I saw recent evidence that corn prices might be coming back just a little bit, and I think that's a pretty fluid situation. People that have harvested high corn yields, and that includes almost everybody, sometime in the last couple years, give that up kind of reluctantly. I've heard a few people say they're all soybeans now. They're going to be that way for a while. But we'll see what happens on that. Those changes tend to be, corn is given up kind of reluctantly by a lot of people. And you can see what our yields have done then. So both yields and area have gone up. And that's so I look at this as a ratio of corn to soybean yield. And it says something about their relative, agronomic productivity related to one another. And in recent, the last couple decades, we are hovering around 3.5. You just divide corn yield by soybean yield. So we've been hovering in that 3.5, and anything that's higher than that is favorable to soybean. Anything that's higher than that is favorable to corn and not favorable to soybean in agronomic terms. Anything lower than 3 or so is certainly favorable to soybean. So one of the reasons soybean could get the hold it did in the United States is that this ratio was so low early in the introduction of the crop. And it was because corn yields were low. But when people said, I can get 50 bushel corn yields or I can get 25 bushel soybean yields, the soybeans tended to look a little bit better to them. I'm from Fulton County, of course, and You know, we never grew soybeans. Fulton County did not have very many soybeans in 1965. The first year we grew a little patch on the farm was, I think, about 69 or something like that. And it wasn't a great success. But with feedlot beef and so on, corn was, and wheat, a little bit of wheat was pretty much what people grew. Unless they still had dairy cows, but there weren't very many that did anymore. So that's why they came in. So the why and how the soybean moved in, land on which to grow, usually replacing another crop with less needed, reasonable and reasonably stable yields within the cropping system, economic value based on domestic use or exports, declines in yields or yield stability in competing crops. And this is why they stay. Yield improvements with no yield retreat compared to at least to competing crops, ability to counter pest and disease problems that develop, and stable or increasing value compared to competing crops in countries and in the world. And we won't say a lot about diseases and insects, but it's been an extremely important part of the soybean story. To have a crop grown on as many acres and as long as this one has, I know, John, you're going to tell them about the soybean insect problems, but it's probably worldwide one of the crops that can grow with pretty minimal worry in the U.S. Corn Belt about insects and diseases. Oh, we worry about insects and diseases some, but we don't have, you know, if I was in Brazil and had just sprayed my 5th time for stink bug, that's when I'd be really worried, because they're going to be there next year and the year after that and the year after that. But we don't have anything really like that in soybeans, cyst nematode and some of these kinds of things, but they're generally manageable. And it's a very important aspect of this that we, and I don't know if that's going to last forever or not. There are the only places in the world I can think of, though, where the crop has almost been ruled out is in India. They have viral diseases carried by whiteflies. And those are really difficult to control. But the really hard to control problems are generally in these subtropical areas where they don't get cold winters and everything is always there. This is what's happened. I don't think I've showed this group this slide before, but this kind of sums up. This is Illinois. I was too lazy to get Ohio's. But this shows corn, soybean, wheat, oats, and hay since they started keeping statistics back in 1868. And I didn't extend it, but it's, you know, so these lines, corn and soybean lines, are pretty much together now. And but if you look at this, you know, back in the 1920s and 30s, 1900 to 1940, basically, our second most important crop that we were growing in Illinois was oats. Why did we grow so much oats? A lot of oatmeal consumption? No, it was actually to feed the horses. And so as mechanization came in, you can see what our oat acreage did. And we grew, you know, wheat was a major crop, and we had a lot of hay. Basically, this is the dairy rotation that held there before 1940. Some people call it mixed farming. You know, my dad growing up, they had rotation, usually about 4 crops out there. You'd grow corn on a single plot maybe every 4 or 5 years, following clover usually. And you'd grow oats then after corn and seed clover into it, and you'd harvest clover for 2 years. It was a nice, sort of stable, not terribly high yielding system, but it fed the horses, it fed the pigs, you know, you sold the cream and you sold some meat, and life was good. So that's what happened, and you know, then things really changed after that, and you can mark the increase in soybean acres to the end of World War II, when corn yields started to go up. We didn't need as much area for corn. You started to use nitrogen fertilizer, and of course then, as the cows went away, the need for forages went down. Oats has essentially disappeared from the state of Illinois. We still have 500,000 acres of wheat and about that much of hay, and that's it. The rest is corn and soybeans. Some people look with dismay on this and say, well, now you have this fragile rotation that's not going to ever last, right? Well, it's lasted so far. So soybean becomes a crop, how and why it moved in, and I already described that to you. The commitment by A.E. Staley to buy and process soybean gave the crop value as a cash crop. It was pretty much a question mark. You know, what were you going to do with soybeans in 1935 if you produced them? They were more of a forage crop at that point than a grain crop. But he said he'd buy them and process them in Decatur, Illinois, and that's what started the whole thing. And they made margarine out of them and things like that. So why they stayed, yields were higher due to being in fields for the first time, and they increased some with genetic improvement. That first time that soybeans were there is usually one of their best times, and they learned to inoculate with soil first, and then they worked out how to inoculate with N-fixing bacteria, and we were off to the races. No really new diseases or insects appeared, at least not big threats, and mechanized, usually earlier harvest and later planting meant soybeans could fit into corn production. Challenges were seed quality, planting equipment. Lodging was a big problem, as many of you probably remember, even back into the 70s. Weed control was difficult. We had cultivation and not much else. Walking. Combines weren't great. And low amounts of residue and poor distribution meant less ability to prevent soil erosion. It was not a big favor of the Soil Conservation Service to bring soybeans into a system because the soil wasn't covered as well. And there was some resistance, active resistance to bringing soybeans in to the Midwest because of that. So this is going to skim through this. My time is going fast here. Just show you that, this is what corn yields did. This is what corn acreage did over these periods from 1940 to today. This is what yields did for soybeans. I just put the Ohio and Illinois trend lines there. Both are rising at about 0.42 bushels per acre per year, and our trend line yield is 52 in Illinois for this year and 49 in Ohio. That's what soybean acreage has done. That's what the yield ratio has done since 1940. So it's pretty much the national story. I just threw those in for the state. And even up to now, this was the blue states here are ones where soybean area went up from the previous year, and that was pretty much every state. And the red states are where corn acres went down. And they pretty much matched up. That's where the soybeans grow. I threw in a slide on North Dakota because it's one of those where acreage is, soybean acres has just gone nuts. These are their yields of corn, soybean, and wheat. This is what wheat acreage has done, and in the last, 20 years, it's plunged from about over 12 million down to about half of that, and the slack was taken up by corn and soybeans, mostly soybeans. High soybean yields are not the main thing. They only need to be high enough for production costs low enough to produce more profit than competing crops. And soybeans can't disrupt or destabilize profitable existing systems without offering more in return. So some of these are just obvious points, but the frequency, severity, and cost to control insects, diseases, and weeds can't be too high or increasing. And that's one of the worries, of course, with resistant weeds that you'll hear more about today. Producing and storing seed needs to be possible without undue risk of quality or quantity, and there has to be a stable market. So soybeans enjoy all of these advantages, and if there's a list to answer the question in the title about why we grow them here, this is why. They have a lot of things really going for them here, including my last point, there are lots of love and understanding. But, good rotations, they're considered a major crop with benefits by the federal government, market to the country and to the world, lack of unmanageable diseases or insects, all necessary inputs are widely available, and an outstanding commercial system of seed production and delivery. Farmer experience, ongoing genetic improvement, and good equipment now that's been designed for soybean. Wasn't always true. This is a real quick summary of the work that several of the soybean people did, and Brian Deers at the U of I, the breeder, and they looked at it just to cut through all these little boxes on here. I couldn't get it by itself, but it says yield 2. They made a line here in 1983 and said they accelerated after that. This was a study in which they collected up soybeans that were released at different years and planted them all together. And so they show that those released after 1983 showed a yield increase of about 52/100ths of a bushel per acre per year. Here's the yield increases for the 4 Midwest states. I just showed you the 3 I states in Ohio over that period of time, 1983 to today, and it's been about 0.52 bushels per acre per year. If you go that just on its face, it says pretty much all the yield increases we've had could be accounted for by genetic improvement. I'm not going to say all of them are, but I think the great majority of them are. And if you went out and grew today soybean varieties, Williams 82 out here, I think you'd be really, really disappointed at what was by far the best soybean at the time it was released is not very good today. So breeding in soy has been an important thing in management to match. GMO varieties as part of it, probably not a yield booster, but was supposed to made crop protection easier, and that's still the case, and we'll skip the rest of that. And the fit in the cropping system. Corn and soybean occupy more than 90% of the cropped area in the Corn Belt. And a decrease in one today means an increase in the other because there's not much else out there. And yields have been increasing faster in corn than soybeans a little bit, but the ratio has not really been changing very much. Many producers have considered corn to be more profitable and consistent than soybean. That's different now than it was 5 years ago. The soybeans really do have to fit into a corn-based cropping system, and they do fit well. They increase yield of the following corn crop and soybean, but it is considered inferior for corn for conservation and carbon sequestration. It's a little bit of a question. Peter Thomason was saying yesterday, there are some producers in Ohio that have had continuous soybeans for a long time. And if you go out and look at that compared to continuous corn, are you going to see a difference in the soil? You may well see a difference in the soil. It's subtle, but corn with all the biomass it leaves, particularly the root system it leaves behind, is considered sort of a better, you're feeding it carbon in corn more than you are in soybean. I just threw in some rotation slides. So we've had corn-soybean rotation, and putting corn after soybean increases yield by 10%. Putting soybean after 2 years of corn instead of 1 increases yield by about 10%. This shows you what it does over time. And so basically just showing you that when corn follows soybean, its yields are more stable than when it follows itself. And that's the returns then. At today's prices, the soybean is the good part of this, and you don't make as much money if you don't have soybean in the rotation. This is another system we've been looking at: continuous corn, soybean rotated, and then 3 crop rotations, and rotations that include soybean yield more than continuous corn, and they're more stable. This is the soybean side of that same rotation. And you can see that continuous soybean is yielding about 10% less than rotated soybean. With corn, if we have a 3 crop rotation, soybeans yield even more. So there it's only in every 3rd year. Returns-wise, that's not necessarily great. When we started that study, we had non-cyst resistant varieties in the continuous soybean. I'm not quite sure why, but as expected, they did not do well. And since then, our yield losses to in continuous soybean have been more consistent but fairly small. And that's the returns. in those system over the years, and for continuous soybean and corn-soy rotated, they give the best returns. Also, we had tillage as part of that. I'm not talking much about that, but soybeans works very well with no-till compared to corn. And cost-wise, the cost savings cancels out any small negatives with yield and makes it more profitable. So what have we learned? Soybeans become a major world crop quickly, very quickly compared to other historical crops. The crop requires much effort to make breeding progress. Some corn breeders say it's because it's a legume. But I think, and even soybean breeders say, it's taking more crosses to maintain the progress today than it might have taken earlier. And we have new tools and so on. We're speeding up the selection of better genes. Nobody really knows if that process, starts to level off at some point. It yields best in temperate areas with 30-plus inches of well-distributed rainfall, moderate temperatures with some dry weather during maturing process. It has not been as successful in regions of low humidity, cool nights or days, or in tropical or subtropical areas with low sunlight and high humidity. Soybeans susceptible to a number of yield-decreasing diseases, and in many but not all areas is less prone to insect problems than other crops. Seed quality, weed control are challenges. The big advantage I haven't talked much about is it doesn't need nitrogen fertilizer, and that's a real advantage today. So with few exceptions, one is oil palm. Soybeans become a major world crop within the last 100 years, providing protein. There's no sign that soybean production is leveling off. Further increases may need to come from yield, not area increases. At some point, the world will probably say enough of our area is soybean. Will there be climate change impacts? I don't know. Are there any threats? Well, I talked to you first when we started about exports. We export about half of our production. Anything. World economy downturn is probably the most scary one. Trade issues, cost lowering in South America, these will all lower prices. Any penalty for soybeans' effect on soil carbon and lower ability to keep soil in place, and I don't really see that coming, but won't rule anything out today. Continuing breakdown and ability of herbicides to control weeds. Some people see the end result of that being, weeds that can't be controlled. We've had some Palmer amaranth fields that have really approached that already. And the appearance of new insects or diseases without effective controls, I would put that as a pretty minor threat at this point. If we've been growing these for 50 years and don't see too much new, I think that's a good news. In newer production areas, especially subtropical regions, continuing increases in insect pressure that increases cost and damage to the crop. An example is stink bug, and it's a scary one. Spread of trade disputes or economic downturn, and an unexpected drop in progress in genetic improvement. These are all possible threats. So we know why we grow soybeans. We've talked enough about it. Will there be a next soybean to come in and sweep these out? At this point, none that I can think of. An alternative would need to produce at a cost lower than soybean production cost that complement of energy, protein, and fat that soybean provides. What crop could even come close? None that I know of. It would also need to grow well under temperate and subtropical conditions, probably utilize existing seed input and marketing systems. So yeah, we'll have things around the edges. Entrepreneurs are always active. Some crops might have some promise. But the old idea that, something new is going to come in and sweep all these soybeans away, or corn, or any other crop, it just does not look very likely. So just to finish up, there's some soybeans being produced by hand in an intercrop system in Sichuan, China. There's what a field looked like in Ukraine, where they were supposed to all be non-GMO, and very few of them were. That had been sprayed with Roundup for sure. That's what they look like in central India. They put corn in them as sort of a guarantee in case soybeans fail. And they said also the workers that harvest the soybeans get to harvest and eat the corn while they're working. So the story of soybean in the world's a remarkable one, unique among crops old and new, and with contributions from both the crop and those who grow it, work with it, you folks. The Midwestern U.S. is a large part of the story. The real success story began here, and it'll continue to roll out here and elsewhere. Thanks a lot for your attention.